My name is Jen Whaley, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. It's my pleasure to introduce the presentation, Chess Analytics, Winning Moves When the Clock is Ticking. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ella Papanek, quantitative sports trader for SEG, to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I've been playing chess for a little over 10 years, and one of my earliest memories playing chess is I encountered a position where I saw a move that appeared to be almost definitely winning, and every continuation that I saw seemed very good for me, and I was about to play it, and suddenly I noticed a refutation that my opponent had. And my opponent was slightly weaker than me, so I started wondering, what's the chance that my opponent actually sees this refutation? And after the game, I ended up asking some other chess players, what would you do in this situation? Would you gamble on playing a move that you know is not objectively the best move? There's a refutation that makes it objectively bad. But would you gamble on your opponent not seeing it? And the response from almost every chess player is, no way, you have to play the best move. You are playing the board. You're not playing the opponent. But I disagree. And so I started thinking about, what are the situations in chess that we can find edge that are not just about finding the best move, but taking into account the situational factors of the time on the clock and who you're playing. So to analyze this more deeply, I wanted to construct in-game win probability models for chess. So just as some background, chess uses the ELO rating system, which basically says that the win probability of a given player is related directly to the difference in ratings of the two players. So for example, the probability that a 1600 rated player beats an 1800 should be the same as the probability that a 2000 beats a 2200. So the ELO rating system gives us something that we can refer to as the player's expectation going into a match. This is basically if you're awarded 1 point for a win, 0.5 points for a draw, or 0 points for a loss. What is the expected value of the player going into the match? So then after the match, we observe a result, 1 for a win, 0.5 for a draw, and 0 for a loss. And we use this result to update our opinion of that player's strength, so that player's ELO rating. And so the new ELO is the previous ELO times something we call the K factor times the difference between the observed result minus the expected result going into the game. So for example, if a player wins a game and they went into the game with expectation 0.6, we have 0.4 times some K factor. So what is this K factor? It can be intuitively thought of as a measure of uncertainty. So if we have a player who's played very few games so far, we probably feel somewhat uncertain about our estimate for their rating. So every additional game that we observe, we want to be able to integrate that into our new data set and update heavily off of that. For example, if we have a player who has not played a game in a year, we probably want to have a higher K factor because the additional games that we're observing are highly uncorrelated to the games that we saw earlier. So we don't know if that player has changed in strength over that course of time. We don't know whether that player has gotten stronger or weaker. So a lot of these factors play into what the K factor should be. And in most rating systems, it's something that starts out very large and then gets smaller as the player plays more and more games. So obviously, ELO is good for understanding pre-game win probability and then updating post-game. But there's a lot of things that it misses out on. It doesn't take into account situational factors. So in chess, one of the most notable situational factors is who's playing white, who's playing black. White has an advantage, and at almost all rating levels, white has a slightly higher win rate. It also doesn't take into account player tendencies. It doesn't tell us anything about time on the clock or what phase of the game we're in. So for that sub-game information, we turn to chess engines. The basic idea of chess engines is that they are evaluating a decision tree of potential moves and then recursively deciding what is the best of these outcomes that they can see at all of the terminal nodes. And so a chess engine basically takes a position along with the information of whose move it is and then outputs a number on the scale from black is winning to white is winning. And this number can loosely be thought of as a number of pawns. So for example, if we say a position is evaluated at +2, we can think of that as white has an advantage approximately equivalent to the value of 2 pawns. So with this pregame information and then the eval in-game, there's a few questions that I think would be interesting to answer. So first, can we construct a well-calibrated in-game win probability model that takes into account these factors and actually gives us edge over just what a computer eval would predict? Second, can chess be appropriately modeled as a Markov chain? So what this means is, does the history play a role in the game outcomes? Can it help inform our predictions, or is it entirely irrelevant? And then third, what qualitative information can we extract from identifying these factors that are relevant to predicting win prob? So are there certain trade-offs that we can better understand as players and use those to improve our strategy? So the data I'm using is from Chess, which is a great source for just publicly available chess game data. It consists of pregame information, so player elo, time control. Time control refers to the duration of the match on the clock. So there's 4 primary time controls used in chess. There's also subgame information, so every move that is played in the game, the time on the clock of each player after each move, the engine evaluation at every position, and then the ECO classification, which refers to a categorization of different openings. So there are like flank attacks and gambits, and those end up leading to different types of positions. And then we also have the post-game information, which is the result of the game as well as the rating update. So chess has 3 primary game phases. There's the opening, the middle game, and the end game. And so the way that players think about these phases is very different. So in the opening, people are focused a lot on piece development and controlling the center. In the middle game, they think a lot more about formulating an attack and trying to gain space. And then in the end game, people mostly shift their attention towards pawn promotion and getting their pieces appropriately positioned to maximize that. So I knew that players play differently in these 3 game phases, so I wanted a way to identify what game phase we're in at any point in the games we're analyzing. So I ended up developing a heuristic based on the number of captures and the ECO depth, so that is how much of the opening is considered theory. And this mapped very efficiently with manually tagged games, so when you present a player game, you say, what phase is this position in? And so I was basically using that as a proxy for understanding what game phase that we are in. So in addition to game phase, time on the clock is very important. A lot of people think about absolute time, like does a player have 10 seconds? What does that mean? But it means very different things depending on how much time the opponent has. Like if I have 10 seconds and my opponent has 5 seconds, I have an advantage in the time aspect of the game. If I have 10 seconds and my opponent has an hour, I'm at a huge disadvantage. So I construct time share, which basically refers to the portion of the remaining time in the game that a given player owns. And then one final metric based on eval is cent upon loss. So in the chess literature, cent upon loss is used to describe how close to what an engine would suggest a player is playing. So going into a move, the engine has some evaluation of the position, then the player makes a move, and that engine evaluation is likely to change. If it doesn't change, that means that the player played the move that the engine judged to be the best move, so that would be a cent upon loss of 0. But more commonly, the player will play maybe a slightly worse move, and that difference between what the eval said pre-move and after is the cent upon loss for that move. And so we can use average cent upon loss, which is the average of those numbers over all the course of the moves in a game, to get a sense of the quality of play of a given player within a game. So I won't go too deep into the model, but we're basically using a proportional odds model, which is an ordered logit. So there's 3 results that we could observe, which is 1 if white loses, 2 if the result is draw, or 3 if white wins. And so I wanted to see if game state or game history, or if game history adds any predictive ability to game state. So the game state consists of just what you would observe if you walked into a chess game with no context and you saw the position on the board. So it's the time on the clock, you could talk about timeshare, the eval of the position, the game phase, and the ratings of the players. Game history has a lot more metrics that we can generate based on the way that we arrived at this position. So we could think about the average cent upon loss of players leading into this position. We could think about the maximum cent upon loss. So did a player make a really bad decision in the game or multiple really bad decisions. We could also look at the maximum amount of time spent on a particular move. So was there a really critical decision point that a player took a long time to think about? You could also look at the average amount of time, and then we can look at the number of blunders, which are loosely classifiable as moves with sent upon loss approximately 0.5 or more. And then additionally, we have the time control classification, so it could be a bullet, blitz, rapid, or classical game, and then the ECO classification again. So I split my data into training and testing data, made a series of models with various combinations of these factors, and then also made time control specific models that are specified to bullet, blitz, rapid, and classical. And we tried a variety of different validation metrics to evaluate the performance of these models for predicting win probability throughout a bunch of games. So all of these metrics, we want them to be close to 0. So as you can see, model 4, which is the model that incorporates game history as well as game state, as well as interactions between those, is overperforming any of model 1, 2, or 3. But the bottom chart also includes the time control specific models, and we can see that those actually all perform better than model 4. And so that suggests that there are differences in the way these factors impact the decisions that players make and their win probability depending on time control. So I wanted to highlight a few games that really bring out these differences. So this is a game that is a classical match, which means it's a very long game, played between two players whose ratings are very far apart. So white is a much weaker player. On the y-axis, we have win probability of white, and on the x-axis, we have number of moves, so what move we're at in the game. And here, the red line is the time control agnostic win probability model, and the yellow line is the classical win probability model. So the yellow line is the model that understands that this is a long duration game. And here, the yellow line converges to the true result much more quickly. And this is because one of the notable factors of this game is ELO differential. So these players are very far apart in rating. And the classical win probability model understands that to be a much more significant factor because in slow games, it is a lot more impactful. Whereas in short games, rating differentials might not matter as much because there's more variance. Players of either rating are more likely to make blunders. A second game that I think highlights another interesting feature is this bullet match, which is between two similarly rated players. And again, the red model is the time control agnostic win probability, and the yellow is the bullet win prob. So here you can see a pretty big drop around move 12, and you might think, oh, this player, white, likely blundered around move 12. But in fact, white made a move that did not change eval even at all. It was very standard move that was one of the candidate moves that the engine was suggesting, but white spent 14 seconds deciding that move. And bullet is a time control in which 14 seconds is around 25% of your time. And so allowing 25% of your time to elapse on a single move is very, very costly in bullet. And so that's why we see the bullet-specific win probability model dropping much more significantly because that model understands the value of time share relative to positional features much more than the time control agnostic win probability. So one of the big takeaways is that game history is significant. So the reason we believe this is because the models in which game history was incorporated are much better at predicting than the models that only include game state. So I think a lot of people would be quick to assume that this is due to human psychological factors, that there's a psychological game going on where a human makes a blunder and feels upset about it and makes poor decisions because of that. Or maybe a human is evaluating a tactical position, spends a lot of time on it, can't find a good tactic, and then regrets that time spent and is stressed about the time control. I think those are possible, but I also think there's a large contributing effect of just pure informational factors. So game history, while it does tell us the psychological element, is also just additional information. It's more context for the game state. So in a game, if we know that a player has been playing very poorly in their as measured by their cent upon loss leading up to this position, that is almost an improved version of the ELO that we have going into the game. So this is the exact description of the player's current performance. And since these games were played online, it's possible that players were tired or distracted or multitasking. And so the cent upon loss leading into to that particular game state can provide us with that information. There are a few interaction terms that are highly significant in these models that I find quite interesting. So one is the interaction between evaluation and the winning player's rating. So what this refers to is the player who the computer believes has an advantage in that position. So that's a positive interaction. And one way to think about this is that stronger players are able to more effectively capitalize on advantages. So if we have a position where a player is +2, let's say, if that player is 1,300, that's very different than if that player is 1,800. If that player is 1,800, it is a lot more likely that that +2 advantage will actually crystallize into a win than if that player is 1,300. They're more likely to squander the advantage or to not even be aware that that advantage exists. Another interesting interaction is between timeshare and game phase. This one comes as, it seems a bit counterintuitive to a lot of people. People think that time matters a lot more at the end of the game and the relative time. But the way I like to think about it is that when you're at the beginning of the game, you have a lot of game to go, and you don't know exactly how many moves you're going to have to play. And so it's very important that you own a significant share of the remaining time in the game so that you can later make those trade-offs for what moves you want to appropriately allocate that time to. And so a common example I think about is in the end of the game, you can be much more certain about the number of critical moves that remain. You could be aware that this is the last critical move in the game, and you have 2 choices, and you might spend almost all of your time evaluating those choices. Whereas in the beginning of the game, you don't know if it's going to be a game with 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 critical evaluation situations. And then one final interaction that I find interesting is between the maximum move time, so that is the amount of time that the player spent on the move that they spent the longest time on, and player ELO. And this is a positive interaction. And I find this one to be interesting because it suggests that stronger players spending time on moves benefit from that time spent. And this kind of aligns with the idea that stronger players have a good sense of intuition about where to spend their time and how to allocate that time. It's almost like a sense of like, there's a tactic in this position and I know that I need to find it. Whereas weaker players often spend time when they're under attack and looking for a defense that might not exist. And so here, if we know that a player has spent a long time on a prior move, that is a positive indicator, the higher, or that becomes a more positive indicator the higher that that player's rating is. So a few limitations to this model is that it is player agnostic. Lichess has a wide variety of users, and if we were to run something similar on a group of games or a set of players that they have a lot of games in the data set, so maybe like world championship players or players who are very high caliber in like top chess tournaments, we would get a lot better sense of the player tendencies and be able to make specifications based on that. We also lack positional information, so there are a lot of positional features in chess that are highly correlated with certain outcomes. So the most common example of this is opposite color bishops. So when one player has a light square bishop, another player has a dark square bishop, this very commonly results in a draw. And so if our model were aware that this positional feature exists, we should increase our draw probability significantly. And then again, cent upon loss is a limited metric and fails to capture the richness of a position. So while it is a good heuristic for the skill of a player throughout a game, it is not perfect because if you have a forcing sequence where a player is just executing the only move that they have as a response to what their opponent played, that player will have 0 cent upon loss, but that doesn't reflect a player who is playing in an impressive way. They're just making the only move, and so that was the only move the engine suggested. There are a few interesting applications for this kind of model. So the first would be betting markets. chess betting is definitely lagging behind betting markets for other sports, but recently a lot of major sports books have added pregame chess betting. And so if there were to ever be in-game chess betting, as there is in like football, basketball, hockey, this is the type of model that could potentially underlie the pricing for those markets. Additionally, I think there's a lot of exciting applications in coaching. So when you're coaching a chess player, it's very useful for that player to understand features about their opponent. And this kind of model could be used to derive a lot of metrics that would be useful. So for example, phase dominance. This would refer to the phase in the game where a player accumulates the majority of their win probability. So if we look at a win probability graph, it starts at some value based on all the pregame information that we have, and then eventually settles to 1 or 0, or potentially a half. But if a player progresses from 60% win prob going into the game, ends at 1, we might think differently if they accumulated the majority of that win probability in the opening versus in the middle game versus in the end game. So if we look in aggregate at the win probability trajectory of many, many games from the same player, we can get a sense of which phase of the game they're strongest at. And if you're preparing for an opponent where you know this information, it makes a lot of sense to tailor your approach to the game to take that into account. So if you know you're playing a player who often sacrifices win probability in the opening, you might want to play a very tactically complex opening to take advantage of that. Another interesting metric is volatility. So in chess, there are two primary styles that people often discuss, which are tactical and positional. Tactical refers mostly to calculation, obtaining material advantages through analyzing this decision tree. And positional refers a lot more to the synergies between pieces and having your pieces located in the appropriate squares that will benefit you many, many moves down the line. And so tactical chess is associated with highly volatile win probability because as soon as a player allows a tactic or spots a tactic, the win probability is likely to react to that. Whereas positional chess is a lot more gradual. So a player who wins a very positional game is likely to just gradually accumulate win probability throughout the course of that game. Another interesting metric is performance under time pressure. So it's very common that certain players are known as players who get under time pressure. But I think what's more important is the actual quality of moves that the player is making when they're under time pressure. So we can use cent upon loss or other skill metrics to evaluate the difference in quality of the moves that a player under time pressure is performing than the moves that they make when they're not in time pressure. And that's kind of a good gauge of whether a player is getting into time pressure as part of an intelligent decision and understanding how to appropriately allocate their time, or if they're simply failing to make decisions quickly enough throughout the majority of the game. I also think there are some diagnostics that players could use to understand their own skill in games. So a common thing in football is win probability forfeited when we think about a decision that a coach could have made. If you could go for it on 4th down, but you decided not to, we can look at the difference in expectation between those two decisions and say, by not going for it, you forfeited 3% in win probability. So we can come up with a similar construction in chess where we say, we have a certain game state, and we move to a new game state. How does the win probability shift over that game state? And you would think, oh, it's just going to identify where you blundered. But it could potentially identify situations where a player instinctively recaptured after an opponent took a piece without thinking when there might have been a better move. Or it could also capture situations in which a player was spending excessive time on a decision that was not very significant. So I think classifying games by these trajectories would be very useful for players to be able to identify their specific weaknesses and then also find grandmaster games where grandmasters have similar play style, similar openings, similar game tendencies, maybe even similar performance under time pressure, but manage to win in the situations where these players are losing. And so I think this is a great way for players to better understand their own style and start moving away from the mindset of exclusively playing the board and start taking more into account the game theoretic factors and the psychological factors and play the opponent. And I think a lot of players right now could stand to benefit from this approach. So that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hey, thank you. This is really interesting in how it shows that a game state can embed so much more than just the evaluation of the pieces on the board. Does it say anything about what the optimal move could be that might be different from that positional evaluation? Like when you're talking about phase dominance or how some players are better in the opening, I mean, it seems like this means it's quite possible that there might be moves that are suboptimal conventionally, but could bring a game to a close much faster by breaking an opponent in the opening or accumulating that advantage more quickly or stuff like that.
Yeah, I definitely think there are situations where suboptimal moves are optimal in the game theoretic sense, so moves that an engine would not evaluate as strong. I guess some common examples of this are when you're playing with a lead in time, so when the opponent is under time pressure, you might have a move that is very strong, the computer is recommending, but it simplifies the position significantly, which will make it a lot easier for your opponent to play that position. And so it might be advantageous to play a move that retains the complexity in the position just to force the opponent to continue to spend time and continue to go through calculations. I think that's a common one, but also making assessments of the probability of your opponent to see certain refutations or certain moves is another common one that I think is not a lot of people do, but I think it is strategically optimal at certain levels.
We could probably do one more question. Or not. Thank you so much, Ella.
Of course.